So what are the debates like in like the Pauline life, like in all these like fun scholarly debates you have on Paul? Like what's the sample of like the lay of the land with like the conflicts going on right now?
I mean, one of the big ones is what school you kind of find yourself, right? The kind of the school of thought, how people read Paul. So you've got kind of the old school kind of Lutheran Paul, kind of the Reformed-ish, Augustinian-ish, kind of Lutheran-ish Paul, who saw salvation as something that's is basically built on the judge and the person being judged, all that sort of stuff. And you've got the idea also of kind of the individual and her standing before God versus kind of the corporate body versus all these other things. Then you had what's called the New Perspective on Paul, which was big in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And aside from maybe a few holdouts in the Lutheran Paul camp, the New Perspective is kind of the dominant view in New Testament studies, insofar as everyone agrees with the questions they were asking, because the New Perspective on Paul basically said, in order to understand Paul, you need to not think about 15th and 16th century debates about Roman Catholicism. You need to go back to the first century and see what Paul was arguing like as a Jew. And so they asked the right questions, and most often than not, their answers were considered inadequate or imprecise or whatever. But they were asking the right questions about getting Paul back in the first century. And that's people like N.T. Wright, the late Jimmy Dunn, and others. And then you have the Paul within Judaism school, which kind of shunts a lot of the questions about, say, creedal Christianity or kind of later categories of Christian thought, and locates Paul squarely in Judaism as a Jew and all this sort of stuff. And they're kind of correct, but I think the movement's a little more excessive, but I get the point. And then there's the big one, the apocalyptic Paul, which basically has Paul thinking about basically it's a debate on Paul's epistemology. How did Paul conceive of the world? And how does that Christology and that pneumatology, all that stuff kind of work? And it's often categorized as seeing Christ as the one who invades a hostile cosmos, say like D-Day or the invasion of Normandy, in World War II. Kind of Christ is the tip of the spear, driving back into the hostile world. And you get that from, say, the Gospel of John, light and darkness and those sort of cosmological kind of issues and stuff. So those are kind of the four schools of thought, generally speaking, that are fighting. You have fights about justification. You have fights now about whether or not Paul should be seen as a covenantal or a contractual theologian, and the differences between those. You have questions about the extent of participation in human agency and kind of all of that. You have issues of divine violence in Paul. Those sorts of questions. How does God act? And it's a lot of really interesting stuff. But as you can see, you tweak one thing in Christology, then you have to think about, well, how does this work with pneumatology and eschatology? And should we even be using the phrase eschatology? Because is Paul, and so it gets into all sorts of questions that analytic theologians and philosophers love, that New Testament scholars are slowly beginning to think about, which is really quite cool.